And first of all, I just wanted to thank the previous two speakers. I find that both compelling and grave, and there's no pun intended on the word grave, of course. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce to you, if you don't already know, Professor Paul Rogers from the Department of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford. Paul's research interests are, I think, possibly quite well known, but I think for those benefit people who do not know about Paul's work, it's worth just quickly saying the sort of things that he deals with. Particularly things like the changing causes of international conflicts, particularly socio-economic divisions and international security, and of course climate change, something that we'll be looking at today. Also terrorism and the West's responses since 9/11 to the so-called global terrorist threat, Middle East security, particularly an area that I'm very fond of, the Persian Gulf region, arms control and disarmament, and also environmental conflicts. His recent publications, I say recent because there's a great list of these, include Losing Control, Global Security in the 21st Century, published in 2002, A War on Terror, Afghanistan and After, 2004, very prescient sort of view, A War Too Far, Iraq, Iran and the New American Century, 2 years ago, and just released this year, Why We're Losing, The War on Terror. I think today what we're going to hear is something about two themes which are on the sheet. One, the interrelationship between climate change and the socio-economic divisions and the constant implications of, in terms of violent response. And the second theme, the risk that our elite communities are going to place all their emphasis on maintaining their own security. So we're moving from climate science to the consequences of that climate change. And Professor Rogers, over to you.
Great, thanks so much indeed. Got to start with a rather odd request. Just look behind you out those windows. Just a moment. What you'll see is a rather nice autumn tint with a few leaves coming off, but the key thing is you will see leaves on the trees. When I was growing up as a teenager in East London, every Guy Fawkes night we had a big bonfire outside the back of the house under some sycamore and ash trees. There were no leaves on the trees at all. Autumn now comes about 3 weeks later. And my wife and I have had a small holding in the town of Kirkburton, a few miles out of Huddersfield in the East Pennines, and we've lived there and grown a fair bit of food for the last 40 years. Last week I bottled the first wine that I'd produced from grapes in an open-air vineyard. We actually live fairly near where they shoot Last of the Summer wine, so there's a certain appropriateness to that. I have to say the wine isn't very good. I'm better at growing the vines than I am at making the wine, but there'll be progress. So the first thing is, it's just obvious evidence that it is happening. Winter is about 5 weeks shorter now than it was 30 to 40 years ago. That's the level of the change from practical experience, actually gardening the same spot for that time. David mentioned his background. I need to just mention a little bit about mine. President-elect Obama made the comment the other day about getting a dog for the kids going into the White House, which will probably be a mutt like him. I'm a complete academic mutt. I did my first degree in botany and plant technology at Imperial College and then did a PhD in plant pathology and then worked in tropical agriculture for some time in East Africa. Lectured in environmental science by a very roundabout route, ended up in peace studies. I was interested in that because of the politics of conflict over resources and environmental conflict. One thing I think is worth saying, which in some ways is quite interesting in having moved from the sort of the natural sciences more to the social sciences. I remember very vividly in my third year at Imperial when I was doing the plant pathology course. This was 2 years after Rachel Carson had published Silent Spring, when the pesticide issue was coming very much to the fore. And there was a cartoon in one of the popular papers which showed a skeleton, the skeleton of death, sowing the pesticides over a barren landscape. In other words, the pesticides which were supposed to help feed the starving millions were actually contaminating the land. And I remember being affronted by that cartoon, because I, in a rather idealistic mode, wanted to work in the developing world. As far as I could see, these were people who didn't understand that science had the answers, and that essentially it was wrong to express this in terms of science being against human development. I was very lucky when I did my PhD. In fact, integrated crop protection was coming in and people were moving away from pesticides. But I remember vividly working in Kenya and seeing a training film from Shell, Kenya, which actually showed Kenyan labourers using their bare hands to dole out dieldrin dust into the hoppers of the dusters. And that was when dieldrin, as one of the leading organophosphorus insecticides, had been banned in Britain. So one company was actually completely disobeying what they knew to be the health hazards. Just 2 anecdotes, no more than that. We've got about 50 minutes, so I'll talk for no more than 25 minutes. But so really, somebody get very agitated if I seem to be going on for a longer time. I'll have to bear with me. I probably won't even hit climate change for about 10 minutes, because the title is Climate Change and Security, and essentially I think people want to try and integrate the different themes. Starting point, I think, would be February 1993, when Bill Clinton's newly appointed Director of Central Intelligence, a man by the name of James Woolsey, was asked at the Senate hearings to confirm him in the post, in the post of Director of the CIA, how he would look at the way the world had changed with the end of the Soviet Union. What were the threats now that the Soviet Union had been consigned to the dustbin of history, and Gorbachev, very annoyingly, had taken America's enemy away from it? He said, I like to look at it this way: we have slain the dragon, but we now live in a jungle full of poisonous snakes. And essentially, we are the world's superpower, but we live in a world of all kinds of threats, terrorism and all the rest, and we have to really guard against those and make sure that control is maintained. And indeed, in fact, in the late 1990s, you actually saw a period in which the American and indeed the British, the French and other armed forces did quite transform themselves. They moved away from the mass arsenals, nuclear and conventional, which were directed towards the Soviet Union, to more diverse forces, ones which could actually respond to a diverse range of threats. The US, for example, gave up many of its nuclear weapons, but maintained all its long-range capable aircraft carriers. It put more money into special operations forces. The US Marine Corps was maintained at almost its Cold War levels. So in other words, there's this transformation to this uncertain, potentially rather dangerous world. Towards the end of the 1990s, you then have the political dimension in the United States of the rise of the idea of the new American century. This was always a minority of American political and intellectual opinion, but nevertheless, this was a group which saw the 21st century as being quintessentially the American century. And when Bush came to power in November, well, when he was elected in November 2000, many of the people behind that group with this idea of the new American century came into very powerful positions. Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Bolton and all the others. And there was this very big change in American thinking. People tended to call it the counter-enlightenment. I love the term endarkenment as an alternative. But essentially, you had this period which was heightening this idea that control had to be maintained. The word that I use is lidism. You keep the lid on things rather than looking at the underlying issues, the underlying problems. But that is where we were, and I think one has to remember that prior to 9/11, this view of the world really did believe, with almost messianic fervour, that the United States and its allies were leading the world to a better form of civilization. The free market liberal democracy model was the model, nothing else was available. It was rather similar in many ways to the thinking that you had in Britain in the 1890s, 100 years earlier, when you had the idea of Pax Britannica bringing civilization to the world. I remember a Ghanaian friend of mine, who was a student over 40 years ago, telling me, Paul, very good reason why the sun never set on the British Empire. And the reply was, because God didn't trust the British in the dark. And essentially, if you had this view in the United States at the time of the new American century, people could not accept, among the adherents to this view, that essentially the world as a whole might not see it the way that the United States saw it. So it was very much a question of maintaining the control paradigm in terms of international security, which meant essentially maintaining the status quo for what you might call the elite community.